Okay, welcome to this session of the Lugano Philosophy Colloquia, which unsurprisingly is going to be the last one of the calendar year, but not the last one of the academic year. For the second time in 48 hours, it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Williamson, who's going to give a talk tonight on temporal logic as metaphysics.
Right, thank you. Well, actually, Damiano asked me to talk about some issues in relation to time and existence. So I thought what I would do is to explain, as the title might indicate, explain how the approach that I take to modality and existence in modal logic as metaphysics, how it looks when it's applied to the philosophy of time. So some of what I say is kind of, you can find buried in modal logic as metaphysics, but I will say a few things that are not in there as well. So the broad methodological approach is to take the fully generalized truth of temporal logic as in effect very general structural principles about the core metaphysics of time. And the reason that I'm going to be calling these things logical truths is because I'm really just applying the approach to logical consequence that you find in Tarski's seminal paper on the concept of logical consequence to the case of temporal logic, where in effect the logical truth for a language in which you've well, in general for a language, it consists in the universal generalization of a sentence being simply true, where the universal generalization is understood as generalizing out all the non-logical constants. So as where we've generalized away from anything that is sort of specific and non-logical. Of course, a lot depends on what you count as a purely logical expression. But if we're interested in time, then we're going to count the sort of general structural operators and so on in the language as if they're to do with time, if they're things like in the future or in the past or whatever, they will count as logical constants. So we won't generalize away from them because they're exactly the kind of thing that we're interested in, but we'll generalize away from anything else. And so these general truths are their simple truth corresponds to the logical truth of the sentences that we started from, if they are indeed logically true. And so the kind of principles that we'll be interested in will have no non-logical constants in them, and they will also have no free variables in them because we want them to express fully fledged propositions. So they'll just contain things like identity, the quantifiers, and truth functions and temporal operators and things of that kind. I mean, I'm not going to go push this aspect of the syntax of the language at all systematically in the talk, because I think that would be a bit of a distraction. And so, but one thing that's worth remarking, and that will come up from time to time, is that if you're taking this approach and you're just taking you're considering whether this universal generalization of a sentence is true when you as it were generalize away from the non-logical constants. When you've got some non-logical predicates, whatever it is, things like remembers or something, you will, in generalizing it away, you'll have to replace it by some a predicate variable, which you'll then quantify over. And so the language that we need to consider is automatically going to be a higher order language, just so that it can handle this with generalizing out of predicates which have some kind of non-logical content that we're not particularly interested in. So that there is a connection between what I'm saying today and what I was saying a couple of days ago about higher order logic. It's also going to be important that the quantifiers are all understood in a completely unrestricted way. That we're not just generalizing over some limited domain of things that we happen to be interested in a particular context. Because after all, presumably when we're doing metaphysics, we generally do want to talk at a level of maximal generality, apart from the small number of structural things that we're interested in. And you need to specify a particular interpretation of the quantifiers anyway for the purposes of this sort of connection between logical truth of the original sentence and the truth, simple truth of its universal generalization, because it doesn't make sense to talk about the simple truth of the universal generalization until you've specified what interpretation you want to give of the quantifiers. So that's the kind of logical background to what I'm saying. So the first question is just, how do we handle existence within this framework? And so the natural logical approach is to formalize X exists, where the variable X is in name position, as simply for some Y, X equals Y. So that what we're doing is we're treating existing as the same as being something in the most unrestricted sense of something. I mean, it's unrestricted, but of course it is, when we're talking about individuals, it's still, it's a first order quantifier. We're not abstracting from that. So probably the term exists has a bunch of other meanings that it can be heard as expressing. So maybe sometimes, for example, when we say that something exists, we're really just talking about whether it's concrete or not, or if it was an event, maybe about whether the event had occurred or something like that. So I'm not going to be interested in those kinds of readings, because they're in effect, they're just restrictions of the unrestricted notion of existence by some kind of non-logical predicate, like being concrete or occurring or whatever it is. And and because I'm interested in the logical issues, that's exactly what I want to abstract away from. And I mean, something like being concrete is concrete in this sense of whatever it is, having some material or causal or efficacy or whatever you happen to think of it. Those are things of no special logical interest. So it's better we'll just abstract away from them. And I mean, the one exception to that is if we're interested in the logic of time, we might be interested in a special type of quantification that's just over all times. That, I mean, it could make sense to single that out because of the specific subject matter. But apart from that, we're not concerned with any of these more specific, or you could call them ways of existing. I mean, there's people sometimes discuss, whether there are different ways of existing. I find that a very unclear question, because when you're talking about ways, you're talking about some kind of partition of cases, but usually the partition needs to be, I mean, you don't need to fix it explicitly, but it's kind of given by context. So, if you just ask in a vacuum whether John and Mary walk in the same way, it's very unclear what's being asked. I mean, it could be that if you're interested in some question like, is John imitating the way that Mary walks, or do they share some genetic disability so that they walk with the same limp or whatever it is. But if without some kind of context like that, it's just very unclear what counts as the same way. And so I won't be concerned with as were ways of existing. So that's the kind of setup I'm working with. All of this can be generalized very smoothly to the higher order language. So we can talk about, as we're crudely speaking, the existence of properties, except that's just to be understood as a kind of very rough and ready way of talking in English about the kind of thing that you're interested in when you're quantifying into predicate position in the language. And you have unrestricted quantifiers at the predicate level as well, and you also have some notion of identity or an analog of identity for like properties, and so the definition of existing as being something that makes sense in a kind of an analog way for any type in the higher order language, so that we can talk about in effect what it is for a property to exist, and the same approach is being taken for what it is for an individual to exist. I mean, there'll be more specific differences, but they will come down to exactly how we understand the analog of identity at the level of properties. One thing that you shouldn't do is think of all these different senses of exist as being, as it were, specifications of some more general notion of existence, because if you did that, you'd be effectively, as it were, saying, if you thought that this general notion of existence could be restricted to properties and restricted individuals and so on, but there was all in the background, there was this single, as it were, type-free notion of existence, that you'd really be, in effect, wiping out the distinctions between different types or orders in the language, and the usual effect of that is that you will fall victim to Russell's paradox. So we don't want to go there. As we're just, in a way, slightly overlapping with what I was talking about a couple of days ago. So one advantage of this kind of higher order language is it allows us to have unrestricted comprehension principles, and that in effect means that a universal generalization for any type entails all its instances in a kind of informal sense of instance, and that's that kind of full reading of the higher order quantifiers is kind of presupposed in a lot of applications of second order logic in mathematics, for example, with things like the principle of mathematical induction and axioms of set theory, such as separation and replacement, which are all really only get their proper meaning if they're formalized in this second order setting. And if you as I say, if you try just thinking of all these different types, individuals, properties, relations, and so on, as kind of restrictions of some more general domain of existence, with these unrestricted comprehension principles, which are what give the theory its power, you get contradictions, and if you try to restrict them, restrict the comprehension principles, you'll get something very messy, and you'll have a loss of simplicity and a loss of strength, so that you're giving up on, as we're two of the key abductive virtues that a theory should have. And one thing in the background here, and methodologically, I'm also assuming that the right way to select a logic for a given language, or even comparing different languages, is of a broadly abductive kind, of the same general kind as we would have in choosing between theories in any other science. Okay, so that's the sort of background. Now we need to bring time into it more explicitly, and the way that is most naturally done is by having a sentence operator at t. So t is going to be a term that refers to a time. So so we are going to have some specific quantification over times, and then you can apply this at t operator to the claim that x exists, and that will give you a definition of x exists at t. So it's as we're well on. So you're saying that at t, it's the case that x is something, and so I mean this is pretty natural. It's just saying that existing at a time is being something at that time, and all of this can be applied in a completely analogous way with higher types, if you like, with properties and relations and stateful affairs and so on as well. And so the way that I'm handling at t is the same really as if you had an operator, which you can have in W, where the W refers to a possible world. And then for each possible world, you could have an operator that is just concerns what's the case in that world. And this is analogous to that. It's just being done with times rather than worlds. And then you can define the operators, let's say always and sometimes, as for all times t at t, and for sometimes t at t. And so we can, that will now enable us to make sense of things like x always exists and x sometimes exists, and so on. So I'm doing it that way because it in some ways clarifies the logic when you just have the combination of these quantifiers, in this case over times, but with the at t operator, because it means most an awful lot of the logic is just being done by the logical quantification with the usual analogy with modal operators like necessity corresponding to it, for all possible worlds W in W blah blah blah, and possibly corresponding to in some possible world W in W blah blah blah. So in modal logic and metaphysics, we've got a distinction between two contrasting metaphysical views. In modal logic, they're called necessitism and contingentism. In temporal logic, they're called, I'm afraid these are rather ugly words, but permanentism and temporaryism. And so the idea of permanentism is that the existence of a given object is not something that changes over time. If it exists at one time, it exists at every time. Just as in the case of necessitism, the idea is that if something that the existence isn't something contingent in, whereas the contrasting view of temporaryism is that at least for some objects, existence is a temporary matter. They can go into or come out of existence. And if you're thinking of this in terms of the what the semantics would look like, permanentism corresponds to what's called constant domain semantics, where the domain of individuals associated with each time is constant from one time to another. All times are associated with the same domain of individuals, which is what you're quantifying over when you're talking about what's the case at that time. Whereas temporaryism is associated with a variable domain semantics, where you're allowed to vary the domain from one time to another. So, I mean, the kind of usual reaction to this is, but surely there's something kind of a bit crazy about permanentism and commonsensical about temporaryism, because isn't it a matter of common experience that objects come into existence and go out of existence? They get created and destroyed, and it seems that it's the temporaryism is the view that just acknowledges that obvious fact, whereas permanentism just flies in the face of it and is kind of wildly denying the obvious. But I mean, that's a rather kind of simple-minded reaction, though a natural one. because the permanentist view is that what happens when an object, in cases where we would naturally talk about an object being created, is that the object, it's not that it's starting to exist in the purely logical sense of exist, as where it existed in that purely logical sense all along, but it's, roughly speaking, it's becoming concrete at the point where we would talk of its creation, and then at the point where we would naturally talk about its destruction. What's happening is that the object is ceasing to be concrete, but it's not ceasing to exist in the purely logical sense of exist. It's, I mean, you might say that it's coming into existence and going out of existence in the kind of restricted sense of exist, where exist means be something concrete. Then it is starting and ceasing to exist in that restricted sense. But if we're interested in the general structural questions, then that isn't a relevant sense of exists. So that it's not as though permanentists have got nothing to say about what's going on in these cases. They have their own description of it. And it's not at all obvious the common sense as well even really has a view as to which of these two positions is correct. I mean, it seems that the difference between permanentism and temporaryism in accounting for such cases is at a very abstract general metaphysical level, where you wouldn't necessarily expect common sense to have its own views, and even if it did have some views about that, you wouldn't really expect them to carry much authority. So I think the idea that somehow permanentism is flying in the face of obvious facts is just not really taking account of what the theoretical possibilities are, and so as well you can't refute it that easily, and it's not even clear that that, as it were, it's getting some support from common sense as opposed to just simply being neutral. And the thing about permanentism is that it massively simplifies the logic. Everything goes through way more straightforwardly in the logic, and especially for a logician, that's quite a strong argument that that's the right way to go. Of course, it's not by itself decisive, and this sort of picture can be extended by applying the same sort of view to identity and distinctness, as well as to existence and non-existence. And in fact, there's already a strong case for it, because there are purely logical arguments for the permanence of identity, in the sense that if X and Y are identical at one time, then they're identical at all times. And that's something that you can actually argue for using Leibniz's law of identity. And you can get something similar for that if they're distinct at one time, then they're distinct at all times. So that what that gives you is a kind of view of this permanent, as it were, ontological framework, where all the facts about what objects there are and their identity and distinctness, those are all things that don't change. Change is something that happens within this fixed framework. And you can also generalize that to higher types. And in fact, it's much easier to argue for permanentism when you're talking about properties and things. Once because permanentism turns out just to be a kind of fairly easy corollary of the comprehension principles that I was mentioning before that tell you when you have a property corresponding to a given description. So as it were, that's the kind of permanentist picture of the temporal metaphysics at this most abstract structural level. Now, one thing that I think is worth exploring a bit because it has to do with issues as to the nature of change and so on, is exactly how this @t operator works. Because I mean, quite often when you see that phrase @t coming in, you see it just being used as if it were an extra argument place of some predicate. So, for example, you might see somebody giving a definition of X exists at T, or equally just of, X is I put a rock at T, or it could be X is a person at T, or whatever. And so when people are handling it that way, it looks as though the @ isn't really doing any particular work. It's just there to kind of signal that this is going to be a time parameter that you're concerned with. That is a very, very different view from the one that I've been pushing with the @ operator, where the @t is really a separate logical device that is being applied to something that doesn't have that time reference in it. So the @t, you don't need to kind of identify temporal parameters within maybe the primitive predicates that you're using. You're actually adding it, but by applying this operator. And I think the process of just treating the @t as if it were specifying an extra parameter. I mean, one reason why it's a bit unsatisfying is that it doesn't really distinguish between the cases where you're using the @t or construction from others where you're equally talking about times, so that the argument positions are being filled by terms for times just as much with @t, but where you're not actually thinking of things in the same way at all. So if you take, for example, the S precedes T, where precedes is being understood in a temporal sense, then you've got two argument places, the S place and the T place, for terms referring to times, but there's no @t operator. I mean, I'm assuming that you're kind of understanding it for the purposes of argument in a sort of B theoretic way, rather than an A theoretic way, where you would you actually would try to rework it in order to S precedes, instead of saying S precedes T, you would say something like when S is present, T is future, or something like that, which would be more a theoretic way of putting it. So there's something that needs to be recognized about this operator, and And I think this has to do with the inadequacy of certain ways of thinking about change. If, for example, if you just thought, well, a change consists in something like, you know, one time having a property and another time lacking the property. If that was all that change consisted in, well, I think that's actually in fact, a clearly incorrect theory of change in the following sense. So, if you supposing that you have some property P, and a time X has the property P, and a time T lacks the property P, then you know if you just had that kind of view of time, you might think, okay, that just means that this property P is a temporary property of but actually that's not what's going on really when you think about the example, because P could be the property, let's say, of being liked by Gabriel. You mean Gabriel is an angel, and so we don't have to worry about times when Gabriel doesn't exist, or isn't concrete. And so we can assume that Gabriel's likes and dislikes of times are completely permanent. That Gabriel never changes with their attitude to individual times, and so that in fact Gabriel always likes time S and never likes time T, and so this property P of being liked by Gabriel is not a temporary property, it's a permanent property, even though sometimes have it and other times don't have it. And if you think about it, what's actually temporary in this case is something slightly different. It's a state of affairs that a time with property P is present. Right? That state of affairs holds at time S, but it doesn't hold at time T, and so there is a genuine change with respect to that that state of affairs, but it's not a change in what has property P itself, and so one way you could put this point is that not every difference between times is itself a change, but that every difference between times entails that a change occurs. And I think that we'll lose a lot of structure if we just go to a completely B-theoretic way of thinking, where we're just talking about times as if they were, you know, all we were concerned with is you know, times having different properties and so on, because that isn't capturing what the actual change is, and so I think that just treating these at T as supplying a value for an argument place that takes times as its input is not really getting at what's going on in these cases. So I'll just finally, this is very, very tentative, because I'm not a philosopher of physics at all, and but there's a question which kind of looms over the philosophy of time, which is, well, what happens when we take account of special relativity? And really, one reason why I've never done very much on the philosophy of time is, or particularly the metaphysics of time, is because I don't want to be pontificating about what the implications of special relativity are. But anyway, I'm still going to make a very, very tentative suggestion about how we might want to adapt the kind of setup that I've been describing to take special relativity seriously. And I'm assuming that, just at least for the sake of argument, that that we're not taking it fully seriously. I mean, taking special relativity fully seriously, if all we do is we just arbitrarily select some frame of reference or some time-like with some foliation of space-time into time-like slices, and then just go ahead doing the metaphysics with that, because in metaphysics we are trying to cut at the metaphysical joints, and if we just arbitrarily select one foliation amongst many, then that's that doesn't look as though it's cutting at the joints. And if we kind of claim that it's privileged, but there's absolutely no sign in the physics that this foliation is privileged in any way, then that would be rather suspect. But something that we could do that I think, if I understand things right, which would not be so arbitrary, would be to replace the at a time operator by an at a space-time point operator. So as it were, because that, I mean, we're not picking out any particular space-time point as a privileged one, and any more than when we're using at t operators, we're picking out any one particular time as privileged, because we can still quantify into the t position. It's just that we're handling time by this at combined with a term for a time, and then we could consider adapting this to the special relativistic setting by combining at with a term for a space-time point, and then we could have analogues of permanentism by simply generalizing over all space-time points and saying, if something exists at one space-time point, it exists at every space-time point. I mean, existing at a point does not mean, I should make this clear, it doesn't mean being located at that point, because I mean, so for example, it may be true I mean, just in the ordinary temporal case, it's true at a time that the number 7 exists, but it doesn't mean that the number 7 is located at that time. It just means that, at that time, it is the case that there is the number 7. And so permanentism could be this, as it were, ontological invariance across space-time points. And then, well, temporaryism, you could just define it as the negation of permanentism. But if you want to think of it in terms of genuine change, some kind of analog of change that has some kind of temporal flavor, then you probably have to require that you were talking about an ontological difference between two space-time points that were separated from each other in a time-like way rather than a space-like way. But I mean, that's the so that's just a quick thought about how you might be able to adapt this kind of framework to the special relativistic context. If you thought that that we really wanted to do justice to to that in our metaphysics. I mean, it's not something that I'm going to go to the stake for, but it's a suggestion. So there's, there are some assertions about the metaphysics of time and even of space-time, and I hope there'll be a basis for discussion.